Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's office hours, How to Lead Through Uncertain Times. I'm Jennifer Splansky Juster, Executive Director of the Collective Impact Forum, and we are just delighted to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining. Before we go any further, I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of the land that we are on. The session is being presented and recorded on the traditional land of the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, Menominee, the Ohlone, the Coast Salish, the Suquamish, and the Duwamish people, past and present. And we honor with gratitude the land itself and the tribes of these peoples. Thank you. We also would welcome you all to share with us a land acknowledgement for where you are joining us from. You can feel free to put that in the chat box. If you don't know but would like to look it up, you can use one of the resources here on the screen. If you are based in the US or Canada, we have a website, or there's a great text service brought to us by Code for Anchorage. So feel free to put that in. I'll just give a minute for folks to do that. Folks, yeah. And let us know the Indigenous lands you're on if you are able to share that as well in the chat. Folks joining from not only the US today, we have Canada, Costa Rica, a number of other folks. Welcome, welcome. So I'm going to keep going. Feel free to keep adding your check-in here in the chat. Just a couple logistical points. We welcome you. This is an office hour, so we welcome you to share questions as they come up for you. It's easiest for our team if you can share those in the Q&A box. This is Zoom webinar, which means there's a separate chat box and a Q&A box. So please do use the Q&A box for questions. We want you to know that we'll be sharing a recording of today's discussion. Hopefully we can make that available within about 24 hours. And then if you are using the chat box to reach us, you can use panelists, but if you want everyone to see it, be sure to put your chat to all attendees and panelists. Also, feel free to share any reflections on social media, some handles provided here. You may also see, let's see, do we have our live captioning turned on?
I see the button.
All right, so you are welcome to toggle live captioning on and off using the live transcript button on your screen. Zoom has a pretty good quality transcript, so feel free to do that. If you're finding it distracting though, you can also toggle it off. And if you have any questions, and email's easier, you can contact Tracy, our colleague who is making things happen behind the scenes. Thank you, Tracy. All right, so with that, let's turn to the purpose of today's discussion. Today, our office hours are focused on leading through uncertainty. This is essentially the 2021 kickoff of a series of office hours that we did kind of similar to last year. Last year, we hosted office hours in the spring when the COVID-19 pandemic was unfolding. Shortly thereafter, the murder of George Floyd and the increased racial reckoning and awakening across the US, and just a lot of uncertainty that folks were feeling in their work. And people told us they found it helpful to have these discussions with some of our senior advisors and our team. So we're bringing them back over the next few weeks. Today, we are focusing on leading in uncertainty. I wish we were in more certain times, but as I sense you all are feeling, as am I, kind of a few steps back towards uncertainty, at least in the US here. So with that, we are entering this conversation certainly not as experts, but as fellow journey people on the journey of trying to make community change happen. Glad to share from our experiences and also to learn from and with you as we go. So with that, I want to quickly do a brief intro to my two colleagues joining me today. And we have joining us Junious Williams, Senior Advisor at the Collective Impact Forum and Principal of Junious Williams Consulting. Junious is previously the President of and CEO of Urban Strategies Council, amongst many other esteemed contributions to social change and and communities in which he serves and works. We are also joined by Paul Schmitz. Paul is another senior advisor for the Collective Impact Forum and leads his own consulting firm, Leading Inside Out. Paul builds the collective leadership of organizations and communities to achieve greater impact. He is also the former CEO of Public Allies. So I am delighted to have Paul and Junious join us today. I'm going to have Paul share we're going to turn it to Paul to share a couple framing comments before diving into questions, some of the questions you shared ahead of time, as well as please do share questions in the Q&A as we go. So I will turn it over to you, Paul.
Great. Thank you, everyone. So last year at the beginning of the pandemic, we did some webinars and I wrote a piece thinking about like, how do we respond, and also shared some tools for responding to what's happening. But it's been a crazy year and a half. There's no way to put it other than it's been absurd. It's been difficult. It's been tragic in a lot of ways. We've, of course, had the COVID crisis, which has had many waves, and we're in another one now. We've had the environmental destruction we've seen and continue to see. I was just out west and on vacation, and we couldn't see anything because of the fires. We had food lines we hadn't seen since the Depression as our economy went into dove south, and a lot of businesses and employment stopped, and people had lots of needs. We had a movement for Black lives that inspired the nation, but also forced us to reckon with the continuing lingering causes of racism and the effects of that in our society. We had kids trying to figure out how to learn in this new environment. I mean, stuck home, as I kept joking to my kids, it was like, being grounded used to be a punishment, and this became their lives. But trying to learn how to study and do school in this new way and being really disconnected from so much in their lives. We had an election that SNL found easy to parody, but also we had the insurrection after. There's been a lot going on. And in this environment where so much has been happening in the US and I know around the world, the question is really like, how, as a leader, what does this mean? And I just want to share some reflections I've had as I've worked with groups over the last year and a half that kind of build on a piece I wrote last year for the forum, just thinking about like, what does it mean to lead now? If you could go to the next slide. And so the first thing is that it's okay to not be okay. If someone is well adjusted to a world that's maladjusted, that doesn't really work, right? Like, we're all struggling in different ways and there's a lot going on. And it's okay when people are struggling with things because there's a lot to struggle with now. The second point is that it means that we have to lean into empathy at home and at work. And I'm going to talk more about that in a moment, but I've come to believe that in this environment, empathy is the most important leadership skill. And that a lot of us, both in our homes where we've been kind of stuck with family members more than maybe they or we would like, or we're at work or working with people who have a lot of things they're balancing between work and home and everything else, that we'd have to lean into it in both. The third is that we have to practice self-care. When we get on a plane, they always say, before you help anyone else with their mask, make sure you put yours on, right? When you're trying to get oxygen. And it's important as a leader that if we're going to try to be supportive of the people we are facilitating, supporting, leading, we have to make sure we're keeping our tank full. And whether that's meditation or long runs or walks or playing music or binge watching TV or whatever helps us find balance and find space is really important, and finding that space to care for ourselves and not feeling guilty for taking time off or taking time for ourselves or doing things to kind of balance ourselves. We need that. The fourth is that it's okay if you're off strategy, that many of us had strategic plans and we had measurable objectives for every year, and we're no longer exactly on that path. And that's okay, because the disruption in our external environment is greater than any disruption we've ever faced. And that disruption has meant that a lot of us are not where we thought we'd be. And that's okay again. But we should have a path back. We should recognize a lot of the businesses who create the foundations or the funding that supports us are off track also. I'm sure that many of them are not meeting their annual objectives. And so when funders push back on us, we need to make sure that we're also challenging them about the fact that this is just reality. There's an asterisk on all of our data for these 2 years. Whatever issue you're working on got a lot more complicated, and we might have had to do things that are off strategy, but we should have a plan and be making intentional choices that while we're off strategy, we are going to migrate back. The fifth is that if we're off strategy, it should be because we're addressing the special needs of vulnerable populations, that the populations of people in our communities have faced challenges that were unexpected, that they were unprepared for, that had massive differences in how people are. And that as an organization or group, we should be thinking ourselves, well, what assets do we have to provide to the community in this case? I'm not talking about assets like typical, like financial. I'm talking about really thinking holistically about, in terms of our people, our resources, our facilities, the supplies and things we have. How can we be an asset to things that are taking care of the most vulnerable people in our community right now? I thought it was great when the Boys and Girls Clubs here in Milwaukee, for example, opened up as meal sites when they were closed to youth programming, worked with groups to provide thousands of meals a week. That's not their mission. That's not what they do, but it's something they did to make sure that people in their community had what they needed and using the assets they had. The sixth is to advocate to ensure racial equity in response and recovery. We know that the effects of the pandemic and the economic collapse around it were most especially felt by people of color in this country, in the United States at least, that there were racial disparities in both the disease and the economic fallout. And the reality is, if we're not advocating as new dollars are coming in as stimulus to our cities, to our counties, to our states, and new federal programs, if we're not advocating to make sure that those resources are addressing that disparity and are investing more in the communities that have been hit hardest, it won't happen, and those disparities will just get larger. So it's important that as leaders, we're advocating to make sure there's racial equity in response and recovery. And finally, I think it's final, the seventh, is that we have to learn, adapt, and create the new normal. If we go through this whole experience and we just go back to exactly what we were doing before, it's a lost opportunity. There's been a lot of innovation, a lot of ways that people have shifted and thought of new ways to do things and form new partnerships. There are so many new innovations and ways people have had to adapt. And we've got to learn from those and figure out, what do we bring forward into the future? What do we leave behind? What do we want to go back to? But make those intentional choices, but really reflect on what we've done and think about what we bring forward into the new. And there's also tools that we've shared before at the forum and are still available, like scenario planning and strategy triage, that are also great tools you can use to look at your strategies and figure out in uncertain times, how do I plan a path forward? How do I adapt what I'm doing now? And those are tools that can help you in that process of learning, adapting, and creating that new normal. I want to turn just for a moment more, just as we frame the day, and talk about empathy. And I've really leaned on Brene Brown, who spoke at our Collective Impact Forum conference a couple of years ago, on her work in thinking about this. And I think the important thing is not think of empathy as something you either have or don't have, or you are or you aren't, but as a practice, and as a practice leaders can do. And I love her definition because it's simple. It's the idea that empathy is not about fixing, it's about connection. And it's not just about connecting to someone's experience, but connecting to the emotions that underpin that experience. And she describes 5 empathy skills, practices we can use as leaders when we're working with others. The first is really putting ourselves in other shoes, taking perspective and trying to understand how others see things, asking questions about how others are seeing things and what they're observing and how they're interpreting things, and being aware of our own power and privilege within that. Sometimes we ask things and we're judging it from our experience. Really open ourselves to see it from where someone else sits. And that also includes being non-judgmental. She says that we often judge where we feel the most shame, and that it's important that we listen without judging and really try to understand why, if I was sitting where this person is, how could I experience what they're talking about? How would that seem? Understand the person's feelings, not just what they're sharing, but what are the feelings behind that? What are the feelings that underpin that? And what are the feelings they're expressing? And communicate to them, let them know we see they're scared, we see they're anxious, we see they're sad. Let someone know that we understand and see the emotions under that. And finally, be mindful when we're connecting to somebody, paying attention, listening actively, asking questions, giving verbal cues, paraphrasing back, doing things to let someone know that they have all of us in that moment. There's also what she calls empathy misses, things that people do that they think are empathetic but aren't. And if you click on that, yeah. So the first is expressing sympathy versus empathy. One is feeling pity or sorry for someone, and one is connecting to and acknowledging what someone's feeling. Those are different things. The second is confirming their shame, that someone shares something and we gasp at them, or we say that's horrible. Like we express things about them that make them feel shame about what they've shared with us. The third is to knock them off their pedestal, to say that I can't believe someone like you would do that, or something like that would happen. It's like we say things to let them know we no longer think of them the same way. A fourth is we try to divert them from what they're feeling and talking about that and experiencing that, to really instead pushing and focusing on let's find like who's to blame, and sending that energy into anger and sending it outward rather than sitting with the emotion that might be uncomfortable. The fifth is minimizing, that we tell someone it's not that bad. We try to make it seem smaller, and we diminish what they're actually feeling. And finally, comparing, we one up the suffering. You think that's bad, so-and-so has cancer. And we diminish what they're experiencing subjectively by trying to compare it to something else and tell them it's not that bad. So these are things that, again, as leaders, we can think about as we're in these uncertain times and we're working with people who have a high amount of stress and anxiety and uncertainty, that as leaders, along with the other things we can do, if we can sit in that space of empathy, of really listening and connecting, if we can try to avoid those misses where we can set people off, those are ways we can really, as leaders, help better work with people in these times of uncertainty. So thank you. I just wanted to share those as kind of a framer, and I'll turn it back over to Jennifer.
Thank you, Paul. Always such helpful grounding. And I always am so appreciative, Paul, of how you help people, help us understand that we have to take care of ourselves first in order to, show up for this work with not only our families, but also our colleagues and our communities. And I think so much of this stems from that perspective. So we collected some questions. We're going to turn to Q&A now. We collected some questions from folks in advance. Thank you for sharing those. And I'm going to start with one that sort of builds on, you mentioned Brene Brown, builds on at least where I have learned a lot from Brene Brown with respect to vulnerability. And someone asks, how can leaders be vulnerable when teams are looking to them for certainty? So, and I welcome Junious into the conversation at this point as well. So, Paul, Junious, what comes up for you when you hear that question?
Well, I guess my immediate reaction is I'm not sure that that I would characterize it as the need to be vulnerable as much as the need to be honest and transparent. And to me, those are the key things, is that in this time of uncertainty, and Paul just said this, none of us know the answers to 95% of what's going on around. So for me, the best thing with staff, with other folks, is to be honest. I don't know what the hell is going on or is going to happen either, but to make a commitment to people that you're going to be honest and transparent, especially if you're in a leadership role, you're admitting the uncertainty and you're making a commitment to figuring out where to go with the team, and that I'm not going to all of a sudden have a brainstorm and we're off on some frolic, but that when I get intelligence or you get intelligence, it's an opportunity for all of us to get together to share that intelligence and to see whether it informs us sufficiently to take action. And if that causes people to characterize one's behavior as vulnerable, I guess that's okay. But I would want to characterize it more as I'm going to be honest and transparent. And I hope everybody in the team is that way too, because that's how we're going to figure out where and what the best steps are.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Again, if I, not to lean on Brene Brown's work too much, but she talks about how vulnerability is courage. And I think that honesty and transparency is also part of that. And I think that being intentional, being transparent, being honest is the best way to approach it. And we don't know. And there's in the previous webinars I shared that Stockdale paradox, which comes from the book Good to Great by Jim Collins, where he talks about being having faith you'll ultimately prevail while also facing the brutal reality of your situation as it is now. And I think that holding both of those, that knowing that, listen, we're going to get through this, and having faith that we have the tools, the capacity, the people, that we will move through this, but being very real about where we are, what's going on, what we know, what we don't know. And it's holding both of those at the same time. So not being honest and transparent and saying, and therefore, like, I don't know if we're going to exist in a year, like, I still give people kind of like, we're going to get through this, but here's our reality, and let's be real about it and what barriers we're up against, and let's think through this together and work through it.
Yeah, thanks both. Another question that we got in advance is, how do you answer or respond to the question, I'm tired, when a collaborator says that to you? Whether, that could be a team member, it could be a community partner. And Paul, you talked a little bit about this in your list of 7, but that is the reality. I think it would be surprising to me if most most folks weren't tired right now, physically, emotionally, etc. And one thing I would just start with is receiving that, and having a conversation with folks about how can we help you start first as a person. How can I show up in support of you? As you're thinking about it a little bit further down the line in like the work context, one kind of frame that I find important, and I know a lot of colleagues find important, is helping folks decide between urgent and important. Is this urgent? Is this something that has to happen right now? In times of the pandemic, like, yeah, there are actually a lot of urgent things, and that's probably what's so tiring. But sometimes I think we think about things that are important, but we conceive them as urgent, and maybe they can wait. Maybe we can wait a little bit, or maybe we can create some new or different space to take on something that is certainly important, but it might not be urgent, and we can get through a bit of our exhaustion. Paul, Junious, what else comes up for you?
Well, I would I want to go back, because Paul mentioned characterizing the honesty and transparency as courage. The other word that comes to mind that I think permeates all of the questions I'm seeing in the chat and otherwise is the notion of humility. Is that leadership has to demonstrate humility because it can be contagious, and you need folks in an environment. And for me, the first thing on that is, I'm not sure it's a question. I think it's a statement, and that is really key. The person doesn't appear to me to be asking a question, but just saying, I'm at my wit's end. And I think the first thing to do is a whole line of inquiry to understand what's going on with the person as a foundation for supporting them in reaching a decision. So, it's stuff like, well, what's going on? How did you get here? What's happening with you, to understand whether or not it's soluble or not. If it's something that is totally external and it's driving it, that there's a family condition or an organizational condition, it would be important to know that. But I think it's also important, as one understands that, the origin of that conclusion, asking the person, well, what do you need to continue? Do you even want to continue? But it's a process of, I think, kind of just inquiry and listening and trying to understand and not trying to jump to solutions too quickly, but trying to direct the questions where it might help to suggest some alternatives. I would also say this, that ultimately it may be that it comes down to, is there some other area of work that we're doing in this collaborative that you might need to move to? Is it necessary maybe to consider taking a break from this work, having somebody else from your organization represent it, but getting a good sound understanding of what's going on that might help to elevate what might be some possible options. And I think that the ultimate thing is to say, whatever you decide, that you've been a contributing member, we're going to support you, whether it's at this table or whether you need to do some other work. You have our support because you've been a contributor, and that the door is always open. If you decide that you need to take a hiatus, doors always open to come back.
Yeah. Susan added in the chat that when our partners and leaders are tired, we ask what we can do to lift the burden. We step back and ask less of people. We focus on the highest priority for the community, not the organization. Thanks, Susan. And I think that prioritizing is a piece of that as well. And just, to Jennifer's point earlier, I think so often, at least with clients I've worked with and partners, that they often create timelines, and they forget that they're the ones who made the timeline, and that they can extend the timeline. Like, they have the power to say, okay, we're going to extend the timeline. And I think sometimes timelines are artificial constructs people put on the work that are driving them crazy. And I am all for being somewhat aggressive and trying to get to results and try to move things forward. Absolutely. But we also have to, a lot of us are running marathons, and we need to be able to maintain our pace. And so at times it's okay to just step back and make those intentional choices, as Judy has said. And it's really important to just open ourselves to that and make it an intentional choice. Don't just slip into it. Just have the conversation and be real, and make that possible.
Yeah, you've begun to speak to this, Paul, and Junious, but the next question here was, how do you fill your tank when you're the tank filler? How do you step back to breathe from going 100 miles an hour when services really are needed?
I'll step in and say, you just have to plant boundaries and hold them absolute. When my first child was born, I had just become CEO 3 months before she was born, and the organization I became CEO was in a financial crisis. And trying to manage being a parent of a newborn and the crisis drove me also almost crazy. So when my next children were born, we had twins, I put a boundary around it. And we had another crisis. Congress had killed our federal funding, and we had to fight to get it back. And what I realized is I learned how to work smarter, but I also put that boundary around. I realized we were fine. And I put boundaries around my life later as a CEO, and had family time as an absolute critical component. And I still worked hard, but I've just always, with the people I've worked with and with CEOs I've coached and others, just said, you have to put the boundaries around it and stick to them. When I was a CEO, it was like, listen, 6 to 9 p.m. is my family time. I will not be interrupted. But if there's something urgent that can't wait, if you want to text me and see if I can communicate after 9, I'm open to it if it's a night thing. But during those hours, I will not be reached. And I gave that same respect to my employees and colleagues of just I put boundaries around things and created time. And whether it was putting on my schedule every day when I was going to exercise, and my assistant knew that I was not going to be interrupted early in the morning on that. And it's just, and we still got everything done. And I think that's the other thing. I think sometimes we don't put boundaries around it. And we slip into a workaholism that isn't the most productive. And there's lots of studies about that. And sometimes when we put the boundaries around it, it allows us to make more choices and to keep ourselves better managed and better balanced. And so I just am a big believer in setting those boundaries and working hard and recognizing, I've never had an 8-hour-a-day life. It's just not how I operate. But I've always spent, and everyone who knows me knows that my family comes first, and I do take care of my health and other things. And I think you can do both if you set the boundaries and really manage yourself and manage the expectations of others around that.
All right. Folks on the line, feel free to add some questions to the Q&A. We definitely have more, but want to re-invite that. We have a question here. Could you speak about norming empathy skills as a way to recalibrate groups, especially in folks working in the K-12 space? So I think the question is about how do you, if a group needs some recalibration, maybe you can bring some empathy skills into that group to help them with that recalibration.
Do you want to take a go, or do you want me to start? And it's always hard when there's two of us paneling. We're trying to figure out how to.
No, go ahead.
I'll just start and quickly say that I think one way is always check in at the beginning of meetings and ask people how they're doing and use some questions to kind of ground people and understand where people are at and what they're dealing with. This morning I was on a call and there were 3 of us, and each of us had something really kind of hard happening in our lives. And so then we just walk in knowing that's happening and can understand that. So I think checking in, I think as a leader of a group, kind of modeling that by, again, going back to that first question, being honest and being vulnerable and being open about like, hey, I'm struggling with this, and like modeling it, creating check-in space at the beginning of every meeting so people have a chance to kind of express how they're doing. We usually use like, what's your battery strength on a scale of 1 to 4, and like something else, and just like let people kind of, and if someone's a 2 or 1, like, okay, I know I need to lean into them a little bit more, check in with them. And so just like find ways to create space for it.
I want to say that I am really struggling. I have always considered myself to be a fairly empathetic person. In the current environment, I'm struggling with empathy, and will readily admit it. I am having difficulty, given all the lying that's going on and distortion in this culture, what's happening around the pandemic, what's happening around the election. And I have a real problem and difficulty, and probably need some assistance. All of my traditional practices and around empathy, I just can't mount them to create a sense of empathy. And it's not only external people. I had a real trouble with some family members and close friends trying to be empathetic and having the vaccination discussion. I just got infuriated. So I just say that to say that this is a really difficult time. And I would be open to anybody else's suggestions, but I'm just going to be honest. I have trouble developing and practicing empathy when the underlying belief of somebody else, to me, is just, I can't relate to it. I can't connect to it. I get these mental blocks every time I try to process through it, to listen more carefully. And, I'm disconnected. So that's my admission against self-interest, is I can't do it in some settings right now, and it bothers me.
Yeah, I have family members who, because of political issues, I don't feel I can connect with in that way. And I think that it is a harder environment in a lot of ways for that. I think within our groups and our coalitions, we're hopefully we have more shared values. I think that again, like creating the space for people is great. And again, like I would have a hard time if somebody was doing that. And there's some great comments happening, by the way, and some tools that people are. I like this compass of shame idea. I want to check that out, and some of the other things that people are sharing. Thank you for doing that in the chat space. But yeah, it is. I'm definitely someone who I used to. It's funny. I thought I was really empathetic until a project I was working with had me take this emotional intelligence like test, and then I found out I wasn't as much as I thought. And I started realizing it's something I have to be more actively thoughtful about, because I'm kind of an introvert and often in my head, and it just realizing I needed to be like more present in things and like pay attention to it. And that's why I like share that tool, because it's one I've had to use to think about it.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Junious. Junious, I don't know if you're tracking the chat, but folks are agreeing and appreciating your perspective.
Yeah,
+1.
Absolutely.
So we have a question from Tamara. I'm new to being a supervisor and work in disaster response and recovery. And I'll pause and say thank you for that super important work. I'm still trying to figure out my leadership style and not always feeling confident. That said, I know my staff need me to be confident. How do I project confidence until I feel confident?
We're having a stare down. I'll jump in for a moment. I mean, there is a fake it, but I think
fake it till you make it right.
So when I do my leadership development work, I did at Public Allies and Beyond. One of the core things I always said to people is get really clear about what you're good at. What are the couple things you know you're really good at? And also understand what you're not, because none of us has the whole package. That's why we have to collaborate with each other. And kind of going back to Junius's point about humility, if you have confidence in what you bring and humility about what you don't, to me, that's the right mix, right? And I think that while you're trying to convince yourself of that, I think there are some tools and activities that can help you kind of draw out. But there's a reason why you're in the role you're in. And there are things I'm sure you know you do well. And I think sometimes people are afraid to put those up because they think that people will think. And I think as long as you're also open and aware of what you don't do so well, and you can hold both of those, that's what really I think is really a critical component of leadership is being confident in what you bring and having humility about what you don't. And when you know that about yourself, and when people can see that you also have that humility, I think they respect the gifts you bring more, because they know that you're not just like kind of seeing yourself as in one way. But yeah, I don't know, Junious, how or Jennifer, how have you approach that?
Well, I get a little nervous about confidence because the notion of being perceived as confident has so many culture, gender, and other lens to it that I'd be really careful about framing what I want to manifest to people in terms of confidence, just because the continuum from confidence to arrogance, if you're a woman, is a really short distance. If you're black or other person of color. So I'd be really a little bit skeptical about letting things get framed in that way, and instead would, as Paul started down this, what are the skill sets that cause people to put me in the position of leadership? What are the other things that my folks need from me in terms of my leadership role, and doing those things, hoping people will, and again, I shy away from the confidence, but more toward people view me as competent and as, helping to move things along, being a good person to work with. And so I would be especially careful if I was a person of color or a woman of assuming and getting into that confidence sort of thing, as opposed to saying, what are the things that I want to project to people that are important to me, and that are needed by the people that I work with.
Yeah, thank you,
Yeah.
Junious, for that addition. I was thinking about some of the gender and racial norms around confidence, unique to each different identity, but that's a really good reminder. I was also laughing as an aside. I don't know if anyone watches the show Ted Lasso, but there was a very funny scene last episode about sort of the feeling comfortable with your presence in order to show up for others. But anyway, Ted Lasso watchers will appreciate the reference. So let's see. I'm going to shift to a couple more kind of tactical questions. We have one here around just like managing team meetings during this time. And given where we are in the calendar year, folks have things they want to work on, but they also want to recognize vacations and the holidays. How do you go about convening in the back part of the calendar year? Do you set something and see who comes, take a poll or a survey? What do you think?
Go ahead, Paul.
I see groups doing a mix, right? Some set a time and say this is when it is. Some doodle poll it and try to find dates. And I think the key thing is that you should only meet when you have an agenda worth meeting about. I see some groups do meetings because they said they were going to do meetings versus because they have something to do. And I'm a big believer that in collective impact, meetings should be organized around action commitments, around problem solving, around aligning and coordinating, not around reporting. And so to me, if you don't have something to solve, if you don't have something to coordinate, and you don't have action commitments you need people to make, then, and you're just going to be reporting, then it's not worth doing the meeting. And so I would keep meetings focused on really interactive, action-oriented times. And how you do that is, should be based on the group. I've seen one of the cool things I've seen with Zoom is like when people can't make meetings, people record meetings so that people can see them if you have people who can't make them, which is something we couldn't do with live meetings easily. So that can be, that to me is an opportunity we didn't have before that we have virtually. But that's what I've seen.
Yeah, what it causes me to think about, and I've been thinking about this in a lot of different senses, about what have we learned during the pandemic that we need to carry forward in our practice. One of the things has to do with like maintaining virtual meeting capacity that while in some ways it's impeded the way that we normally interact and do things, but by the same token, it's opened up the opportunity for a wider array of people who were previously excluded from in-person meetings to participate. And I raise that because I think that on this specific issue, that we're in a state where who knows when, well, I've already concluded we ain't never going back to the old normal. So whatever the new normal is, needs to anticipate that people are going to be in and out, so that we need more robust ways of managing the fact that people aren't going to be at every meeting. So how do you quickly brief people? Do we need to do other things? Paul mentioned recording sessions so that they're there. Should we be doing the 2-minute written summary, or should we use the same technology and have somebody broadcast a 1-2 minute meeting update that I can do? How is it that you manage the fact that people are going to be in and out so that it doesn't disrupt the continuity of the process? As Paul saying, you only want to have meetings when there's something that really needs to happen in a meeting session that's of substance, and not just because it's scheduled. So it puts even more of an emphasis on being able to capture what happened in that meeting, because you're anticipating that people aren't that there's going to be some level of absence. So I guess my thing is, are we thinking proactively about building out robust infrastructure where we can efficiently and quickly bring people up to speed, and whether it's through some of these other devices or what we do at the beginning of meetings, but some way to make that easy for people to come in and out, because that's going to be a steady state, I think, from now on. Babysitter, whatever it is, childcare, the whole myriad of things that are going to cause people who are usually religiously attending every meeting to not be able to do that. And our systems and structures need to support that in and out.
Great, great. All right, let's keep them coming. So another question. When your team or a group that you're leading isn't responsive to actions supported by evidence, how do you lead? When your team or a group that you're leading isn't responsive to actions supported by evidence, how do you lead? Asking this of some very evidence-based
I'm kind of
folks.
like, when I hear the without evidence, I'm starting to drift into Judith's empathy gap with people, because like that, like that's just like, that's hard.
Well, I mean, I'm along that same line that I probably made some errors in personnel selection. I'm being honest. If I've got people who are kind of devoid of evidence-based stuff, I've done something wrong, either on who I selected, their onboarding, their training. Um, so that's a difficult one to think about. But for me, the first thing is that I got some big work to do, because I need to work with them around why that's important and what their concerns are about why they're not evidence-based. And having gone through some of that, I know that there's some likely candidates that it stifles a certain type of innovation, which I think is correct. So how do you create a structure where we're going to be largely evidence-based, but we've created a structure through which, and a process through which, we can innovate? But in that process of innovating, we're damn sure going to collect some data. So if you ain't even into that level of producing some data around things that aren't currently evidence-based but are innovative and meet those criteria, then we got a real problem, and we may have to part ways. I'm going to be honest. If I had a staffers like that, given that I'm a backbone and we're responsible for all this, it's probably my failure, but got to do something. It can't have a bunch of folks who don't appreciate the nuance around that and the way in which we need to orchestrate things so that we're heavily evidence-based, but we're creating opportunities, especially for residents and other people with lived experience and young people and others who might see this stuff totally differently, to come in and innovate. And because it ain't evidence-based, I mean, that's always been the catch-22 around evidence-based. You don't give people of color and women and other marginalized people the money and evaluation and infrastructure to create the data to make it evidence-based, and then you say, but we can't do this because it ain't evidence-based. You've got to have a structure to break out of that, and it's some criteria and a process to do innovation with a commitment to collecting the data that might put us in a position to determine whether or not there's sufficient evidence to validate a particular tool or approach.
I agree with
like that I both get to be a panelist and an audience member for these sessions.
Ditto.
I do these.
Ditto.
Jennifer, do you have something else I was going to add? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to add that we don't know the context for where that question came from, but I think sometimes different folks respond to different kinds of information and data. And so still totally agreeing with Junius's perspective. I think there are some folks that are really well, persuaded by charts and bars and consultant PowerPoints and stuff like that. But a lot of research shows that it's actually stories and experiences that are more effective at moving people. And so depending on how you are bringing that evidence to bear, there might be other ways of sharing evidence that is also coupled perhaps with stories and hearing from folks with lived experience that might have a greater impact in getting folks where you're trying to get them to go.
Yeah, I want to acknowledge Elizabeth Garst's comment, just that, that not all evidence is value free, that there are biases in terms of what data is and how it's used and things like that, which is true. But again, I'm assuming that you're a group that is taking in information and deciding what we're going to use it with. What I experience is there's often two other points of resistance around this. One is that I find groups, a lot of people find it easier to be activity of focus versus strategic. And to me, the difference is between doing stuff that is nice and feels good and creates activity. Strategy is making choices. A good strategy tells you what to say no to. And it's about prioritizing and figuring what's going to have the most impact. And again, using information and our experience to develop that. But it means saying no to things. And I think a lot of people tend to not like evidence-based because it means saying no to things. It means not doing things that they might want to do or enjoy doing, or might be things that are lower hanging fruit. The other thing I find is that people often don't want to be accountable. And I don't think it's a conscious, like they don't want to be accountable, but I think it's like, if I put a stick in the ground and say, I'm going to get 600 more kids to grade level reading, then like, I'm scared. What if we don't get that? What is that going to mean? How is that going to, like, they get worried. And so then they create some like outcome that's got lots of fancy language, but means nothing. We're going to increase the level by 10% over 2010 with like, da, 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 da. And I see these like statements that like, they get the language to a point where no one has to be accountable for anything. And then again, it allows people to do lots of activities and hope their activities are contributing to a result versus doing strategies that are truly at the level and sophistication necessary to move the needles they're moving. So I think that can be helpful. And again, I think that there's a lot of ways that people might resist or struggle with it. And some of those are real. And I that's why I wanted to call it Elizabeth's comment, because I do think sometimes there's culturally constructed or other things. But the other thing that we talk about a lot is making sure that when you're interpreting data, you're interpreting it with the people whose lives it's about. A lot of us use data walks and other things as ways to have people interpret the data together and make meaning out of it. And that the data you're gathering is responding to what people you're working with and the communities you're serving are asking for. And so also not just like thinking that data is something objective out there, but it's something that's part of it. So thank you. And great comments in the thing. Thanks.
All right. This may be our last question. We'll see how long our responses go. So we've found it extremely challenging to be in touch with community members for our community engagement work. And I assume this means during the time of the pandemic and with a lot of the distancing and shelter in place orders. Are a series of listening sessions a better solution than meetings? How are you thinking about community engagement right now?
I'll take a first stab, which is just from a group I'm working with now. I think it's a mix of things. I think what we've learned is that there's no one way to do it. That I think the groups that are doing it well have multiple ways they're engaging with people. I'm working with a group right now that's doing planning. They're doing data walks and with groups of residents through churches and organizations where those people already have trust and relationships, and working with them to like help inform a process. They're doing listening sessions at other places. They formed a table of residents to advise their work. And so I think there are a mix. I've seen people use, Facebook chats, and I've seen people use various Zoom meetings at various times and repeating them to kind of listen to people. And so there's a variety of ways that I've seen people try to use engagement in this context. But I still would argue one of the best things you can do if you already have the relationships, it's a lot easier to do engagement. If you don't have the relationships, you need to work with the people who already have those bases and those relationships to help you access the people. because it's harder to build those first trusts when we have more distance and are electronic and everything. And so like utilizing partners who already or who have a base of relationships that they can call upon might be a way to do it. But if you already have the relationships, what I find is the group's doing great community engagement. We're doing great community engagement before the pandemic, and they've just moved those relationships. Those who don't have those relationships, I think have had to build partnerships with people who can bring those relationships.
Yeah, well, I would start by asking engagement for what purpose, you know? And at these times, I think there's a pretty high standard for why, especially you want to engage people in a face-to-face context, given just the pandemic. But I think that a lot of times, and it goes back to the same point Paul made about a meeting. Be clear on why you're doing it. And a lot of times there are much more efficient ways because, and I hate the engagement language, although we're stuck with it, because it's so damn amorphous what that really means. But I think that that demands that then you really figure out what is it that you, and why is it that you want to engage community, and that you plan for the engagement in light of what you're trying to achieve. I just think there are so many times where the engagement stuff is just for purposes of checking the box. And so it's not thought out clearly, it's not purposeful, it's not working with people who regularly convene and work with residents and others. We just sort of throw the stuff up on the wall and hope that at least hits the check box that says we're through that a part of the process. So that would be my advice. I want to say one other thing really quickly, if I can, that's a little off this topic. But I want to go back because in Paul's lead off, when he talked about that you might be off strategy, I want to go back for a moment because I agree that it's okay to be off strategy. And I also agree with the advice that, but have a path back. But what I don't want people to miss is some pretty substantial stuff has happened in the last 18 months, right? Yeah. That has revolutionized and changed this planet. And so don't be surprised and don't just kind of rotely construct that. You should have a pause in there to ask, are we doing the right damn thing, right? Is this the right strategy? Because we've had the whole influx of understanding social determinants of health, and that should have influenced us a lot in terms of our root cause analysis and what we're working on and whether or not that's the right leverage point. There's a lot going on. So I know that we're all like creatures of habit, and we told some funder that we were going to do this. We told other folks that we were going to do it, but it doesn't relieve us of the responsibility of leadership to stop and ask ourselves and our partners, is this still the right thing to be doing? Because maybe you need to adjust in light of the racial awakening, the economic depression, the pandemic, the insanity in the political realm might call for some different set of strategies.
Drop the mic. Yes. Thank you, Junious. I think that's a great message for us to end on. So I know we're coming up on time. Thank you everyone for joining. It's a treat to be in conversation with you, Junious and Paul, and to always learn so much when we come together. We have more opportunities in the next few weeks if folks want to chat more with Junious on September 1st, sort of questions oriented around embedding equity in this work. Some of the questions we didn't get to today were more focused on that, so I'd encourage you to join next week. And then in 2 weeks, we have time with Paul to talk about managing difference and difficult conversations. So kind of building on, perhaps going deeper in some of the topics we talked about today. So we welcome folks to join us. For even more learning with the forum, Junious, Paul, and others, we wanted to make sure folks know about our upcoming Champions for Change workshop. This is something we do every year. We refresh it every year with current content. And this year we're offering it in a new structure. We have one kind of big conference kind of learning day, Tuesdays for 3 weeks in a row, starting the week of September 21st. And then we have office hour sessions somewhat along these lines, Wednesdays and Fridays of those weeks. So we invite you to register and join us at Champions for Change for further engagement with Paul Junious and other faculty. And then finally, I will just point out, if folks haven't come across it, we have a podcast. This group and others are featured in many of our podcasts. And we also have past conference sessions, and we have both kind of how-to sessions and more keynote-oriented sessions that live in our podcast. So we encourage you to subscribe on your platform of choice. So with that, I will say thank you. Hope to see and chat with many of you in the coming weeks. And thank you for joining during these unpredictable and tough times.